Hello everyone, it's Exercise Ed, and this week we're going to go through the whole Bible non-stop. So I hope you've been practicing. Alright, let's go. Creation, rejection, promise of blessing, land and nation, Exodus to make a kingdom but divided, exile, return. Jesus left at the resurrection, preaching the message to every nation while awaiting his new creation. Alright, let's go to part 1. Creation. God spoke and made the world. God spoke and made the world. Then God made people to rule the world. God made people to rule the world. It's all good. So to summarize, God's people in God's place under God's rule. God's people in God's place under God's rule. God's people in God's place under God's rule. And finished. Alright, let's go to part 2. Ready? Creation, rejection. We reject God. You're not the boss, I am. We reject God. You're not the boss, I am. It's the problem of sin. It's the problem of sin. Can't live in God's place. No place, no place. Can't live with each other. No people, no people. Can't live with God. No rule, no rule. It's the problem of sin. It's the problem of sin. And we need saving from this problem we're in. Right. Ready for part 3? Creation, rejection, promise of blessing, land and nation. Ready? Here we go. God's going to solve the problem of sin with 3 promises to Abraham. The promise of nation, God's people, the promise of land, God's place, the promise of blessing, God's rule. He promised them to Abraham, then Isaac, then Israel. But there was still the problem of sin, and we still need saving from this problem we're in. Okay, ready for part 4? Alright, you're going good, guys. Creation, rejection, promise of blessing, land and nation, Exodus. God makes a nation, that's Israel, God's people, but they're in Egypt. Place, no rule, they're slaves. That's right, be a slave. Oh yeah. Now be Moses. Part those seas. God saves, and then on Sinai, God gives his law, his rule. On Sinai, God gives his law, his rule. But sacrifices show the problem of sin, and we need saving from this problem we're in. Ready for part 5? Creation, rejection, promise of blessing, land and nation, Exodus to make a kingdom. God gives Israel the promised land. God gives Israel the promised land. But the judges show the problem of sin. And we still need saving from this problem we're in. Then the first king Saul rejects God. We need the promise to David, the promise of God, a Messiah, a Christ. King. Oh yeah, a Messiah, a Christ, a King. Oh yeah, then Solomon builds the temple. Build it. Oh yeah, then Solomon builds the temple. Build it. It's almost God's people in God's place under God's rule. It's almost God's people in God's place under God's rule. But Solomon still had the problem of sin. And we still need saving from this problem we're in. Okay, ready for part 6? Alright. Creation, rejection, promise of blessing, land and nation, Exodus to make a kingdom but divided. Ready? Here we go. Solomon, then his sons, reject God. Can't live with each other. They fight, so Israel divides. Judah south, Israel north. Israel divides. Judah south, Israel north, and they've still got the problem of sin and still need saving from this problem they're in. Ready for part 7? Creation, rejection, promise of blessing, land and nation, Exodus to make a kingdom but divided, exile. Ready? Here we go. Israel in the north had the problem of sin, so exile to Assyria. Bye bye, and dead. But Judah in the south had the problem of sin. God's promise through Isaiah, a servant who will suffer to deal with sin. A servant who will suffer to deal with sin. But first, let's go to part 8. Creation, rejection, promise of blessing land and nation, exodus to make a kingdom but divided, exile. Ready? Here we go. Judah in the south had the problem of sin, so exiled to Babylon. Bye-bye. People need changing, but how? God's promise through Jeremiah. New hearts. A new heart's what's needed for the problem of sin. But first, they're slaves in Babylon, 70 years. They're slaves in Babylon, 70 years. No people, no place, no rule. Where's the promise? No people, no place, no rule. Where's the promise? They still got the problem of sin and still need saving from this problem they're in. Alright, let's go to part 9. Creation, rejection, promise of blessing land and nation, exodus to make a kingdom but divided, exile, return. Back to Jerusalem, rebuilding the wall, build it, rebuilding the temple, build it. It's still under rule of the Persians, Greeks and Romans. Where is God's promise? They've still got the problem of sin, and they still need saving from this problem they're in. Alright, we just finished the Old Testament, now let's go to the New Testament. Ready? Creation, rejection, promise of blessing land and nation, exodus to make a kingdom but divided, exile, return. Jesus left at the resurrection. Ready? God becomes a human. He's the Christ, he's the servant, baptized for his mission. He's the Christ, he's the servant, always lives under God, no problem of sin. Always lives under God, no problem of sin. Then this servant dies to deal with sin. But then God keeps his promise and raises his Christ. He is God's person. He is God's place. He is God's rule forever and ever. But what about now? Creation, rejection, promise of blessing land and nation, exodus to make a kingdom but divided, exile, return. Jesus left at the resurrection, preaching the message to every nation. Jesus ascends, then sends his Spirit. Time to preach. Preach it. Trust Jesus. He'll take away your sin. Trust Jesus. Turn and live for him. Trust Jesus. Then wait for him to come back. Big finish. Creation, rejection, promise of blessing land and nation, exodus to make a kingdom but divided, exile, return. Jesus left at the resurrection, preaching the message to every nation while awaiting his new creation. He's coming back to judge. Every nation will bow. He'll bring his people to his place under his rule. No more problem of sin. It's all good. Forever. Oh, pretty puffed out after that. But guys, we just went through the whole Bible non-stop. Well done, guys.